Hello everyone, and as always, I'm your host, Alexander Shade, and welcome to a new show here in the Void Theater called Character Study. Before we introduce our first star, let me try and break down how this works. First, we take a character from a show and give a brief introduction to them, their history, personality, relationships, everything like that, and then we take a look at their best and their worst episodes and we see how the character works in each example. That seems simple enough, right? Okay then, with all that being said, let's begin the show and let our first character take the stage. And who better to start than with the internet's least liked animated mother, Peggy Hill. Alright, so what is there to say about Peggy Hill? I mean, besides what every other YouTuber has already said about her. And then again, and again, and again. Yeah, it would seem Peggy got quite the reputation in the last couple of years in the YouTube community, and for a pretty good reason. See, Peggy is let's just say she's a complicated character. One who's real easy to hate, and really hard to love. Now hold on to that because it's going to be relevant later in the video, but right now we don't have all the time in the world to talk about everything Peggy does right and wrong, but we can look at two very specific episodes, and just to give Mrs. Hill a fair chance, let's start with what I think is her best episode right before we dig into her worst. So with that being said, let's begin with what I think is Peggy's best episode. That is Season 5, Episode 5, Peggy Makes the Big Leagues. And without further ado, let's put the episode on stage and see how it plays out. So the episode starts off with Peggy getting a call to come in and substitute for a bedridden teacher while Hank has a meeting with the Arlen City Booster Club about the rise of its star football player, David Kalaiki Ali, who's played by Brendan Fraser, who also happens to be a student at the same school Peggy is substituting in. And it's around this point that we're beginning to see the episode's central plot point. See, David really doesn't seem to care about his education or honestly school in general, and after Peggy begins talking to the other teachers during lunchtime who essentially tell her the same thing, she decides to make it her personal mission to ensure that David receives a proper education. And if we're being honest, yeah, it is an ego boost for Peggy so she can get that satisfaction, but this time it's different. With David, you can tell that there's a genuine desire to want to help someone who she knows can do better with the proper help. Now, I want you to hold on to that because it's going to be a real helpful tool later in the video. But getting back to David and Peggy, we see Peggy try to make genuine attempts to help David with his high school education, including offering to tutor him and even going so far as to make a personal geometry playbook so he can associate with football. Of course, this all leads to the midterm, which David flunks, convincing Peggy to flunk him and have him pulled from the game, which leads to Hank receiving threats from the Booster Club and Peggy being harassed by the teachers at school, all leading into a confrontation between Hank and Peggy, with Hank telling Peggy to give David an A so he can get back into the game. Now right here is where you expect some people to talk about how this fight seems kind of forced just to move the plot along, but honestly this is actually pretty in character for both Hank and Peggy. See, despite Peggy being an avid sports fan herself, she's always been shown to be just as passionate about her students and education and making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to better themselves. Again, hold on to that thought, it's going to be really important later. Meanwhile, Hank has always put more of a focus on extracurriculars like sports and woodshop while also being a die-hard sports fan himself, so it makes sense that he wouldn't really care if David got a decent education so long as he could get the Arlen team to state. It's only something that becomes more apparent when we find the Booster Club trying to exploit any loophole they can find that would allow David to play, that ends with them sending David to Strickland Propane and making Hank give him an impossible to fail quiz, which David still manages to do, forcing Hank to make the decision to pass him, which slowly eats him from the inside out. Again, it's a funny joke and it's completely in character for Hank to demand Peggy pass David so he can take Arlen to state, but it works as an even better joke when Hank actually learns just how, well, let's say dense David can be on any given subject matter. Of course, this all leads to him joining Peggy and trying to ban David from playing in the game. This in turn leads to Peggy and Hank talking to David's mom about his performance in school, all leading to his mom revealing that David is actually mentally challenged and already applying himself as hard as he can in school, which in turn leads to Hank and Peggy apologizing and leaving. Except, surprise plot twist, David isn't mentally challenged and it was all set up by the Booster Squad to trick them. Now, just hold on for a moment. I know I said Peggy was the least like animated mother, but I think David's mom might be in real contention to take it. You don't have any faith in your son's intelligence? Just say he's mentally challenged to the point where he can't even say his ABCs. There, problem solved. But honestly, this episode really only works because of its surprise twist. Not only is David not mentally challenged, but he's ashamed that his own mother would say that about him. In fact, he's so ashamed he decides that if he didn't pass then he doesn't deserve to play, and this is a sweet moment for both Peggy and David. Peggy can be proud she managed to reach him, and David can finally meet a teacher who bothered to take the time to try and make sure he learns something. This time retaking the propane lesson at Strickland and learning and genuinely taking the time to understand what he was being taught, thanks to Peggy finding a way to tie it back to football like she did with geometry. It's got a real nice circular ending to it. And that's why this is Peggy's best episode. The entire thing wouldn't work if David didn't actually care about school or if Peggy was only trying to teach him to boost her ego. It works because both of them genuinely care about their education. It's a simple story, but it only works because the characters have a common goal in mind. Combine that with the fact that no one is acting out of character and you have a genuinely enjoyable Peggy episode with some solid character acting and decent jokes. An all-around great episode. Wonderful job, Peggy. Simply wonderful. Round of applause all around. Let's hear it from Miss Peggy Hill. Okay, now that we've talked about our highs, let's talk about our lows. But we're getting to that, here's a brief intermission to remind you to please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. It really does help the channel grow and it lets me know what type of content to focus on making. And with that being said, back into the theater. Alright, so there are so many terrible Peggy episodes in King of the Hill's 13-year runtime. So many choices, and yet so little time to go through all of them. I mean, there's a time she sold her own house, or the other time she nearly had it repossessed because she got tricked into a marketing scheme, or the time she nearly poisoned the entire city of Arlen by telling them to make mustard gas in her own home. Or the time she verbally and physically assaulted Bill and nearly worked him to death in a different multi-level marketing scheme. You know, when you really take the time to look at Peggy's history in the show, she might actually be the most antagonistic character in it, but that's a topic for another video. So when it comes to those episodes, I can let them slide simply because it's just willful ignorance and willful arrogance. It's annoying, but it's not outwardly malicious. Even the infamous Lupe's Revenge episode is more Peggy's ego making her think that she has everything under control. Again, it's not a great episode, but it's one built on the idea of kind of just being silly. However, there is one episode that just rubs me entirely the wrong way. One episode that jumps entirely from the concept of willful ignorance and explodes into full-blown malice and contempt. That is Season 10's Episode 15, Edumacating Lucky. You know, I said I want you to hold on to that thought that Peggy is at her best when she genuinely wants to help someone better themselves. Yeah, this episode is what would happen if someone took that idea, turned it on its head, and then kicked it in the teeth. Repeatedly. If it wasn't already apparent, I really don't like this episode. So, without further ado, let's put the episode on stage and see how it plays out. So, the episode begins in a pretty standard way with the Hills waking up and preparing for a normal day. That is, until Peggy goes to the kitchen to find Lucky getting a drink there. Now, let's just pause for a moment here, because I need to make something clear for later in the video. I get why Peggy acts the way she does when it comes to Lucky and Luann. Considering Luann's background and her family issues, I get why Peggy treats Lucky the way she does. My issue in the episode isn't with that, but we'll come back to that later in the video. Meanwhile, back in the episode, Lucky gives Hank back $2 of shaving cream he used, stating that his code of honor would never allow him to leave a debt unpaid. A very important theme that's going to repeatedly pop up. Anyway, as the episode carries on, Peggy gets even more tired with Lucky's entire hillbilly attitude and what she believes is his overall negative impact on Luann in her personal future. Now, this isn't a bad reason to dislike Lucky. Honestly, I don't know anyone who would be happy with their child dating someone whose greatest and only source of income was, as Peggy so gently put it, PP money from Costco. It's not exactly up there with brain surgeon on the list of people you want to welcome into the family, but they are in love, and it's already been established that Luann has a habit of not really listening to Peggy when it comes to these types of things. But my real issue starts with Lucky. Not that he really does anything, but that's kind of the point. Nearly every time Lucky appears in an episode, he tries his best to help out the Hill family. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of the episode if the guy who's supposed to be seen as an antagonist isn't all that antagonistic. But again, we'll get back to that later in the episode. But back in the episode, Lucky walks in and begins to help Peggy fold the laundry. And it's here that we learn the main crux of the episode, which is the fact that Lucky, surprise, surprise, here doesn't have his GED, so he decides to ask Peggy to tutor him. Peggy initially says no until Hank appeals to her ever-inflating ego. Now, let's just pause here again, because Hank brings up an extremely valid point. You can't really blame someone for trying to improve themselves. Now, I'm not going to waste time here talking about how nice of a guy Hank is for at least giving Lucky the opportunity to try and prove that he really does want to change. To be completely honest, Hank is probably going to get one of these videos dedicated to him right after a certain other cartoon husband and a weird little blonde child, but I digress. My point is, what Hank is saying is the response Peggy should have had. For someone who believes that she's one of the greatest teachers to ever exist in Heimlich County, you would think she would care a little more about someone who wants to better themselves. Honestly, even if she didn't even like Lucky, she could have just said no, but she doesn't, and the episode unfortunately continues to progress. So Peggy begins teaching Lucky, and for the third time in this video, surprise surprise, Lucky actually takes it pretty seriously and even tries to get a head start on Peggy by reading ahead of the book she recommends to him, which is so immensely satisfying simply for the sole fact that she has been insufferable up to this point. Anyway, Peggy decides to continue tutoring Lucky, and while discussing the Civil War, accidentally breaks one of the figurines, which leads to Lucky bringing up his code of honor again, and finally admitting that he doesn't want to get a GED to better himself. He also wants it so he can finally prove that he's good enough to marry Luann. This in turn leads to Peggy having the ever-brilliant idea to just feed Lucky the wrong answers and force him to fail. Now, we don't have all the time in the world to go into all the moral issues that come out of this idea, and to be completely fair, this is even out of the realm of possibilities for Peggy's psychotic mind. But once again, I just want to say kudos to Hank for trying his hardest to be the voice of reason and try to talk some sense into a woman whose entire thought process must just be that rotating gif of a hamster on a treadmill, but somehow on fire. Quick little off-the-cuff thought here, just a random, completely insane thought, but maybe try to talk to Lucky instead of trying to prevent him from getting a higher education? No? Just gonna keep doing your best to try and ruin his life? Okay then. Anyway, Peggy is momentarily talked out of trying to ruin Lucky's chances for a GED and keeps tutoring Lucky. While doing that, they're interrupted by Luann cleaning Lucky's truck. Now, of course, this is something that's so outrageously horrible that it makes Peggy think that if Luann marries Lucky, her entire life will be nothing but redneck stereotypes. You know, despite the fact that Lucky encourages her to not clean the truck. Really quick, just for all the diehard fans of the show, remember when Luann used to be a top-notch mechanic and was able to identify nearly every problem Hank had with his truck and fix Colin's car? You know, the type of person who would never really care about mud or dirt or getting any sort of grime on them. I really can't imagine why that thought popped back in my head. So anyway, this leads to Peggy intentionally giving Lucky the wrong answers when tutoring him and causing him to fail. Now, this would have already been a dick move without the other bombshell that Luann is now pregnant and Lucky is the father. Now, what I like about this scene is the fact that Peggy sticks to her guns. You can tell that she wants to tell Hank right then and there that she intentionally screwed Lucky to ensure he failed, but instead she just double downs and demands Bobby bring her a drink. It's not a smart choice, mind you, but it's absolutely in character for her. Just like how when Peggy makes the big lead, she decides to teach David no matter what and refuses to back down when cornered by the Booster Club. Here, we see the exact opposite. She firmly believed that Lucky was going to screw up Luann's life, and so she mentally committed herself to make sure that they couldn't be together. For any other character show, that would be a crazy leap of logic. For Peggy, that's just a Tuesday for her. Alright, we're nearing the end of this episode, so let's wrap things up real quick. So Hank goes to confront Lucky and force him to marry Luann, code of honor be damned. And after all this time, Peggy finally admits that she lied and tricked Lucky so he wouldn't be able to marry Luann. Mind you, she doesn't do this out of the kindness of her heart. No, that would be far too easy. She only admits it because Luann accidentally guilt-tripped her into feeling remorse. Again, somehow perfectly in character for Peggy. So after a long argument, Lucky is finally convinced to marry Luann via shotgun wedding, and the episode ends with Peggy kicking Lucky straight in the ribs, because hooray for no consequences. And with that, we come to our conclusion with Season 10's 15th episode, Educating Lucky. Just a quick little behind-the-scenes fun fact. While writing the script, I actually thought I'd been clever in picking this episode as Peggy's worst, only to find out that the King of the Hill subreddit has recurring threads from new users constantly talking about this episode, and how it is in fact one of, if not Peggy's worst episode. However, that is a nice little segue into the other point of this video. Why is this Peggy's worst episode? Well, I think the main issue people have with the episode is that Peggy suffers no real consequence for anything she does in it, which to be fair is such a recurring theme for most Peggy episodes you think it wouldn't faze anyone anymore, but this one comes across as just unnecessarily antagonistic for no real reason. In other episodes like Lupe's Revenge or Peggy Goes to Potts, you can always say she learned something. Here it's nothing. The episode ends with her kicking Lucky in the ribs and that's it. There's no apology to Lucky for ruining his chances at getting a GED, no acknowledgement to Luann that she was responsible and felt bad about it. Nope, just end the episode with Peggy with a stupid little smile on her face. And that's really the main problem with this episode. Like I said earlier, there's a very strong difference between willful ignorance and malicious intent. It's the main reason why I was never that bothered by Lupe's Revenge. It would be very different if Peggy just up and took a child for whatever reason she could think up, but it was just Peggy making a mistake, or committing a felony, depending on how you want to classify it, and that's kind of the main point. It's easier to make jokes when the character isn't acting like a sociopath. But with all that being said, what do her best and worst episodes say about her? Well, a lot actually. Again, like I said earlier, Peggy is a character that is hard to love and really easy to hate. And these episodes show that off perfectly. When she has her highs, they're really solid and she can be absolutely fun to watch. But when she has her lows, they're so incredibly low you spend half your time wishing you were watching a better episode. And sadly, Peggy has a lot of low episodes. But when she's in one of her good ones like Peggy Makes the Big Leagues, you really see the compassion she has as a teacher shine through. It shows that while a strong part of her desire to teach is to better herself, she does genuinely want to see her students succeed. Most of the time at least. Of course, now that I say it out loud, it makes me realize how much of a wasted opportunity it was that we never got more episodes that feature her love of teaching in them. It was treated as a real critical part of her personality up until the later seasons when she started to move into journalism and then real estate. But more importantly, these episodes show just how much Peggy cares not for her students, but also her family. As aggravating as educating Lucky is, I understood why Peggy did what she did, and it's obvious to tell that her heart is in the right place, even if she goes about it in the worst possible way. And that's the main thing, and not just Peggy's character, but pretty much every character in King of the Hill. They all feel real. Every character in the show has this grounded realism about them that makes them feel like a real person. Look, if we're being real here, if you have any type of social media presence, you've seen at least 4 or 5 people who are Peggy Hill in the last couple of years. If you have any elderly relatives, they probably act a bit like Cotton, and everyone who went to school knew at least one Bobby, Connie, or Joseph. But that's the point. Even though they're all cartoons, they have this certain level of humanity to them. And Peggy is the peak form of that. She's the stereotypical housewife of the early to mid 90s, the type that always thinks she's right and refuses to change her mind until the bitter end, but will always try to put her family first. The keyword there being try. In any other show, she would be damn near unbearable, but because King of the Hill is trying to capture that feeling, she fits right in. And with that, we close the curtain on the inaugural episode of Character Study. You know, it's funny, rewatching all these Peggy episodes made me remember why I found her so funny back when I really got into King of the Hill. It also made me remember that Peggy is a narcissistic psycho who will willingly endanger her family's well-being for no real reason. I guess Hank just decided to take the good with the bad on that one. Anyway, before I go, let me leave you with some questions. How do you feel about Peggy as a character, and what do you think are her best and worst episodes in the series? And who else would you like to see a character study video on? Leave a comment down below and let me know. And while you're down there, why not subscribe for more content on the way? Until then, as always, I've been your host, Alexander Shade, and I look forward to seeing you back in my theater.